Question that we had when the event started was, as we have looked at the spread of the madhab, it seemed that the kind of clear-cut lines had already appeared from those times. But you see, this is not really the case, because what I've done is I've given you a summary of the madhab had spread from that time till the Ottomans. That's a huge swathe of time. And so some of it is from the much later period. When we talk about the Awza'i madhab, meaning that the students of knowledge in the time of Awza'i became leading scholars in the area of Western Sham, of Syria and these kinds. They became the leading scholars because that was all called Sham. Sham, that was that area. Iraq was, though it's called Iraq, it included, Jordan and these other areas. They didn't call it Jordan. It was all called Iraq. Iraq meant a larger area. You had Sham, you had Iraq. So Abu Hanifa was the leading scholar, and those students who studied, were in that region, the region of Iraq. Abu Awza'i, who was his contemporary, was the students of Sham were around him, But there was interaction taking place, but that was just the dominant students were in those areas.
Were they known as madhabs?
No, they weren't known. They weren't known. These were students of Imam al-Awza'i. They're the ones who took up the positions there. And they would discuss and debate with the students of Abu Hanifa. But they dominated in that area. Right? So it was areas of influence. It wasn't clear-cut madhab lines, because those same students may have accepted rulings from Abu Hanifa students, and the cross-fertilization was happening, So it wasn't a clear-cut line like when later on we're going to come and they're going to say there's four. You have to follow one, and you can't move from one to the other. That's a whole nother era, a whole nother approach.
Yeah, but the fact that Imam Abu Yusuf, he spread that school of thought only, although he studied from others as well. Imam Hassan al-Shaybani, he was the teacher of Imam Shafi.
Yeah.
Yet Imam Abu Yusuf, he spread that.
Okay, that was one among them. That was one among them who was, we said, brothers comparing between the spread of the Hanafi school, we said, which began under Abu Yusuf because he was appointed as chief qadi. So we said that was a factor in its spread. Not like the factor of the Ottomans, which is much, much later. That factor now became definitive. In that time, it was a beginning factor which caused it to spread. Right? A beginning factor causing it to spread. And Abu Yusuf, basically, because remember, the Hanafi school, by the time that Abu Yusuf was now a judge, was the Abu Yusuf madhab. In fact, remember, we said that Abu Yusuf and Muhammad al-Shaybani, they overturned more than 50% of Abu Hanifa's rulings already. So when we're talking about the Hanafi school, which was favored by Abu Yusuf, was those who, his own. Those, the Hanafi school, according to his interpretation. Right? That's what it came to. So, and it's not logical. If he has concluded that this is the correct ruling and so on, so on, so on, so, then the students who agree with him, he favors giving them positions in the judgeships, right? He would give them these posts because they favored his position. Not because he knew that another position was correct. and he was just rigidly holding on to his. No, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about him having looked at the arguments, etc., and he's concluded that these were the correct rulings. So therefore, naturally, you're going to appoint and support those who share your point of view. That's just natural. And he wasn't thinking in himself, oh, I have to push Abu Hanifa's madhab. No, because he had already cancelled half of Abu Hanifa's rulings. So he didn't look at it as Abu Hanifa's madhab. You understand what I'm saying? It's just us later on, centuries later, looking at the development of the madhab and its spread, right? We are calling it the Hanafi madhab. But remember we said from the very beginning that the madhab could be as much called the madhab of his students as Abu Hanifa, because it was based on discussion. And Abu Hanifa used to forbid his students from writing down his opinions, because he said, I will give an opinion today and change it tomorrow, and one tomorrow and change it the day after. So he used to forbid them from even writing down his rulings. You understand what I'm saying? So what we talk about when we talk about the term Hanafi madhab, we're talking about something which was really not the madhab of Abu Hanifa. It's just what it was called. It was a madhab which was gathering of opinions, which were changing as time went on, different scholars, because if you can have Imam al-Tahawi, for example, right, who was a leading scholar amongst the Hanafis later on, who promoted raising the hands. You say, that's Shafi'i. But he was a Hanafi scholar. So you understand what I'm saying? That from those earlier scholars, though we are calling them Hanafis, and this is just like people say, because of the fact that Imam Bukhari has made, in his book, in putting the hadiths together, some Hanafis, because they don't want to, they're rigidly holding on, and they see Imam Bukhari brings 5-6 hadiths which promote something which is not held by their madhab, they say, Bukhari was a Shafi'i. This is nonsense. This is nonsense. Yes, he did study under Shafi'i scholars, but he wasn't a Shafi'i. He didn't consider himself a Shafi'i. He was a scholar of hadith. And he brought the evidences based on whoever's opinion was out there. If their opinion was correct, he brought the evidences for it. He didn't care who.
But those divisions, it didn't happen in the get-go then?
No.
In the beginning?
No. What it became, we'll talk about that later when we go into the period of stagnation, basically coming up after the fall of Baghdad, in the 13th century. This is really where you see now real rigidity of the madhab take place, where people are punished by the judge. You change your madhab, 50 lashes for this man. You understand? That is now you're talking about different religions. That's when it really fell apart in that sense. Right? Things fell apart. But in that early period, no. But you have, favoritism, it is natural. Favoritism is natural. I mean, even in my own time, people who are my students, it's following Bilal's madhab. Because people studying under me might favor some of the rulings that I have supported, not rulings I've brought for myself, but I've supported. And they say, it's Bilal madhab. He's a Bilali. This is, of course, this is just natural that students, listening to a teacher over a period of time are influenced by that teacher. It's natural. But the important thing is that the teacher teaches and emphasizes that there are different opinions. This is the one that I favor. Here's the evidence, but the other side has evidence, and so on, so. The student doesn't come to think that, this is the only right opinion. It's absolutely, whatever Dr. Bilal says, that's got to be. No. The idea is that, each person will have to choose. You hear the evidences. You may be interested in knowing, what does the teacher actually say? What is his position? Why is his position? But that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to follow that opinion. So the issue of favoring a teacher, this is natural. The teacher that you like, you tend to lean towards his opinion. It is natural. So that's what we saw from the early days. And it repeats itself, over the centuries. Till today we speak about, Sheikh Saleh al-Munajjid as being who? A student of Sheikh bin Baz. Sheikh so and so and so. He's a student of so and so. Yeah. Till today. Anyway, we'll stop here. Salah. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdika. Nashhadu an la ilaha illa ant. Nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. والصلاة والسلام على رسول الكريم وعلى آله وأصحابه ومن استنى بسنة إلى يوم الدين. All praise is due to Allah, and may Allah's peace and blessings be on the last Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and on all those who follow the path of righteousness until the last day. In our previous session, we completed the fourth stage known as the flowering, where the schools of Islamic law multiplied, fiqh flourished. We said that it flourished. One of the big factors which led to its flourishing was state support. State support for the scholars. And this was unique because we're talking about the period really of the Abbasids. We said that the Abbasid caliphs came in under the banner of returning back to the way of the Prophet ﷺ. After the Umayyads had strayed away from the methodology of rule from the top, they wanted to, as they claim, bring it back to the way of the Prophet ﷺ. So we noted that even a number of the Umayyad, the Abbasid caliphs, were scholars themselves, right? Like Harun al-Rashid, was a fiqh scholar himself, a jurist. He had studied under the leading scholars of his day, his time, and had the others also, many of them had good knowledge, but he was outstanding, in that regard. So, these were amongst the factors which led to it. We also saw that with this state support, it meant also that more centers of learning would develop, because the state was behind it. They would support the students who would study. And we also find a spread of debate and discussion, general debate and discussion amongst the scholars. And this was also the period of traveling, where scholars and students traveled all over the Muslim world in search of knowledge and compiling knowledge. Later on, that was basically the feature of the first half, first half of the 200-year period that we look at as the period of flowering in general, right? The first 100 years, really, it was truly flowering. However, second 100 years, things were starting to come to a standstill. It was still widespread, it was strong, but there were elements of stagnation starting to develop. And we said, in this period, part of the stability that came out of this period was that fiqh was compiled in a number of different forms, and hadiths were also compiled, which made fiqh rulings easier. The scholars no longer had to make as much effort to get a hold of hadiths, but now they could focus on the interpretation of hadith, application of these hadiths, right? And we said also the fiqh was organized. With its compilation, it was also organized into two segments, one known as the usul and the other known as the furu'. Usul dealing with the fundamental principles, and the furu' dealing with the various articles and chapters, under which issues are addressed. Then we had, on the negative side, court debates developing. Court debates where, as the Abbasid caliphs began to stray away from the prophetic way, we find that people were now included in the entourage or the court of the ruler for his entertainment, for him and his close friends, his entourage's entertainment. So we found appearing in this latter period magicians, singers, dancers, astrologers, jesters, like you would find a typical European, a feudal court, King Henry the whatever, or of France or Germany or whatever. All the kings had these. This was a standard feature of that period, right? And amongst them was the court scholar. Court scholar who was there to debate, mainly from the two madhabs, the Shafi'i and the Hanafi, debating various issues. And we said it wasn't too long before they ran out of issues to debate, established issues. Then they went into hypothetical fiqh. And the useful hypothetical fiqh soon ran out too. So then they went into useless hypothetical fiqh, and we gave examples of useless conclusions which were drawn from that period, etc. And when we looked at the various sources of Islamic law, what we see there is that the basic Qur'an, Sunnah, opinion of the Sahaba, which we look at as basically ijma, and qiyas, deductive reasoning, and istihsan, or legal preference. These were added to that at the end, the sixth principle of urf, or general custom. These became the six guiding principles of the various schools. And what we're going to look at today basically is the schools themselves. What were those schools that appeared in that period of time? And as I mentioned, we'd look at a number of them, although the actual number was far more than the number that we're going to be looking at. And this is basically section 5 or chapter 5 of the book, which begins basically on page 87 of the new edition. That's the edition, most recent edition done by the International Islamic Publishing House. This edition, which is the one we're using. And there is some difference between the hardback and softback. That should be noted also. But in the softback, anyway, copy which I have, it is from page 87. This is or chapter 5, called the Madhabs, Schools of Legal Thought. So the chapter begins with a general summary of what went on before, and that I've basically covered. Although it goes a bit back to the very beginning, the sources of Islamic law in the first era, which was the time of the Prophet ﷺ, being Qur'an and Sunnah. Then during the time of the righteous caliphs, where we find now ijma and qiyas being added. And then following that, the period of the Umayyad period, where that was extended upon, and coming into the Abbasid era, which is what we are looking at, right? So it was basically in the Umayyad era that we saw qiyas really developing at that point. Sahaba were no longer readily available. The scholars had scattered. Ijma was not as strong, so you find the issue of ijtihad of the scholars much greater during that period. So this was when that function was added. Anyway, we looked at the development within the Abbasid era, and from that now we're going to look at the scholars of this period. Now, there's a certain amount of overlapping here, because some of these scholars, if we look at the Abbasid era as beginning from 750, see, some of these scholars were from the Umayyad era. In fact, Abu Hanifa and Imam Malik began in their scholarship in the Umayyad era, but it extended into the Abbasid, right? Because the Abbasid, we said, starts from 750 with the caliphate of Abu al-Abbas, right? But say, for example, Abu Hanifa, he was born in 703, and Al-Awza'i was born in 708. and Imam Malik was in 717. You see, so basically, all of these early scholars, and these are some of the big leading early scholars, and also Imam Zayd, that is Zayd ibn Ali, known as Zayn al-Abidin. I mean, he was born in 700. He was even before Abu Hanifa, and we're going to be looking at his madhab, and Imam al-Layth also in 716. So mostly Thawri in 719. Most of the scholars we're looking at, the leading scholars of the early part, were from the era of the Umayyads, the latter part of the Umayyads, and starting with the period of the Abbasids. So basically, Imam Shafi'i, of the leading scholars that we looked at before, he is clearly from the Abbasid era. All those who came before him were from the Umayyad era, right? I mean, today we'll just be able to look at maybe the first 3 or so of the leading scholars, right? First among them is Abu Hanifa. Not because necessarily he was the first, as we said, Imam Zayd, known as the Zaydi madhab, he was earlier born, but in terms of notoriety in the Muslim world, Imam Abu Hanifa was the oldest of the main 4 that we come to know about. Now his real name, Imam Abu Hanifa, was Nu'man ibn Thabit, but most people don't know this name. Just like the real name of Abu Huraira was Abdurrahman ibn Sakhr. Yeah. So most people don't know it. Everybody knows Abu Huraira, but you ask what was his actual name. So he became so famous by his kunya, Abu Huraira, that nobody really bothered to find out or knew what his original name was. Same thing with Abu Hanifa, is Nu'man ibn Thabit. And he was actually born in Kufa, which is in Iraq. And his father was of Persian origin. He's from Persia, right? And the father had actually converted to Islam during the period of the Khulafa al-Rashidun, right? Khulafa al-Rashidun, during the righteous caliphs, era of the righteous caliphs. So Abu Hanifa, his early studies was in the field of philosophy and dialectics, which came to be known as Ilmul Kalam. Ilmul Kalam. And this is reflected later in his madhab. The philosophy, the reasoned, logical arguments, Ahlul Ra'i, the people of opinion, the watifers, all of this, you can see relates back to this kind of an origin, that he would support it. And this is not from a negative perspective. Some people look at it from a negative perspective, but no, from a positive perspective, in that he favored the reasoned approach, which was actually the methodology of Ali ibn Abi Talib, as well as Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, who are the main 2 Sahaba who settled in Iraq. They're of the leading companions of the Prophet ﷺ, they're the main 2 who settled in Iraq. Right? And they leaned towards that approach, the more reasoned, looking for the reasons behind. You find many fatwas of Ali as the caliph, which are based on reasoning, logical reasoning, qiyas, etc. Anyway, though he had this origin, and some people, in modern times, maybe have gone overboard in attacking Abu Hanifa, as really not having a hadith background, so he was just into a lot of reasoning, and, that's what he was, as, philosopher, as opposed to really a faqih in the sense of a scholar who's grounded in the sciences, the fundamental sciences of Islam, like hadith, tafsir, etc. But this is actually a false claim. Abu Hanifa studied for 19 years under Hamad ibn Zayd. Now, Hamad ibn Zayd, right, is one of the leading scholars of hadith of his time. Hamad ibn Zayd. He has more than 230 narrations in Sahih al-Bukhari and more than 370 narrations in Sahih Muslim. So Hamad ibn Zayd is a serious hadith scholar. And that's who Abu Hanifa studied under for 19 years. And actually, before that period, of the 19 years, he had reached the level where he could have taken up the position as a teacher himself, but he didn't. He continued to sit under Hamad and study under him until he died. He didn't become a teacher at the age of 40 until after his main teacher, Hamad ibn Zayd, died. And that's, you're going to find this is a common practice of those early scholars, that they would sit under their teachers, and even though they reached the level of scholarship where they themselves could teach, and perhaps even in the classes that they were with their teacher, sometimes the teacher at this point, knowing that they had reached that level, they would direct some of the questions to them and let them answer it and handle it with, this was showing that they are capable, etc. But they would, out of respect for their teacher, remain his student until he died. That was the way. We had another example of that in Imam Shafi'i, studying under Imam Malik, not leaving until he died after more than 20 years of study. Then he went on his own, seeking knowledge elsewhere, and finally ending up in Egypt and teaching from there. Right? It became very evident, in Kufa, that Nu'man ibn Thabit, or Abu Hanifa, was an outstanding scholar. After the death of Hamad ibn Zayd in Basra, because that's where he was, that's where he's based, he was from there and he taught there and died there. Abu Hanifa studied under him, then moved to Kufa, which is where he was born. And then he began to teach. And just the way things were, that once he started to teach, a few students would gather around him in the masjid, and then more and more and more. And the word would spread, that this is the teacher. So though there were other people teaching at the same time as him, circles in the same leading masjid, in the leading masjids in the various towns, he became known as an outstanding scholar in Kufa. So the Umayyads, they wanted him to become a Qadi, or the judge of Kufa. So that would give them a sense of legitimacy. It helped to strengthen their own legitimacy. However, Abu Hanifa refused. He didn't accept it. And the governor of Kufa, Yazid ibn Umar, he had him arrested and beaten, to try to force him into accepting judgeship, but he refused. And eventually they let him out. And again, during the period of the Abbasids, Caliph Abu Ja'far al-Mansur, he also offered him appointment, but again he refused, and he was imprisoned until he died during the reign of Abu Ja'far al-Mansur. Right? That was what happened to Abu Hanifa. He refused these appointments because of the compromises that the judges during these periods were forced to make. Because you're walking a thin line. The caliphs had deviated. They wanted rulings which would justify their deviation. So maybe once in a while you'd have to make such rulings, or you'd have to ignore them, or if raised questions are brought to you, you'd have to, skirt around it or whatever. But the most of the time you were doing what was useful and beneficial, right? But there, Abu Hanifa, for example, he looked at the situation as others can do that. Others can do that. Because it is not that he was going to take up a position which, without his presence, there would be no judge. No, somebody else would be appointed. And it would be somebody with skills to be able to make the basic rulings which were needed for in court cases and these kind of things, but who may be more prepared to take that route of compliance with pressure from the leadership. But since he was the leading scholar, for him to do it would have set a precedence for all who would come after him. And that's why he had to stand firm. Maybe he was tempted, because of course they would offer you good money, etc., etc. But for the sake of the knowledge that he carried, the position that he held in the sight of people, he had no choice but to refuse. And he stood firm, tortured, died in prison, refusing to be a judge. He is considered by some to be among the minor tabi'un, in that he did meet some of the Sahaba, of the lesser Sahaba, and there are few narrations, one or two, which are attributed to him. But really, he studied under Hamad ibn Zayd, who wasn't a tabi'i. His main teacher, Hamad ibn Zayd, was a student of the tabi'un, a student of the students of the Sahaba. That was his main teacher. Also among his teachers was Ibn Abdurrahman ibn Abi Layla, right, who was himself a tabi'un, and his father, Abu Layla, was a major Sahabi, hadith narrator. Right? And among his teachers was the Alawite, one from the Ali family of Ali, to whom the madhab, the Ja'fari madhab, is attributed. That was also one of his teachers. Now, how did he form his madhab? How was his madhab formed? Because each of these scholars has a different methodology of teaching, the leading scholars. And it's good to see the different approaches. We said that Abu Hanifa, having a background in philosophy and dialectics, ilmul kalam, but also a very strong background in hadith, etc., we find that his method of teaching was based on what we would call group discussion. That was his teaching methodology. He would use the group. He would present a legal problem to his students for debate and discussion, and tell them to record its solution whenever they arrived at a unified position. Right? This is through group discussion. We have a technical name for that in modern teaching now. This is one of the modern teaching methods. Rather than the teacher just, speaking directly to the students, telling them, you have the students themselves discuss the issues, and the teacher guides the discussion and helps them to come to the conclusion that the teacher wants to convey, right? I've forgotten the name that it's called, but it's one of the modes or methods of teaching, which is popular in this now. It's become quite popular now. And what he would do actually is that after the students had gone through, discussed, debated, come to a conclusion and wrote it down, he would then start to argue from another perspective. He would take on what we call in modern English devil's advocate, right? He would take the opposite position. Like people do now in debates, they take a subject and you have a person for and a person against, right? So he would now take up that position against. They made a ruling, they came to the conclusion, they recorded it, and he would take the position opposite it. And now he'd start debating and discussing with them, bringing the evidence and so on, so on, so on, so until they were convinced that his argument, now the opposite side, was in fact correct. And what he would do, after all of that, he would, then discuss both sides and then come to which one, in fact, was the most correct. Right? Because he would help lead the early discussion, the first one, which came to one conclusion. Then he would himself lead the second discussion from the opposite side. And then in the end, he would put it all together, then look at both sides now, the two possible approaches to this particular problem, and then discuss which one and why that one would be the best. So you can see the element of reasoning, being the chief factor, right? Though evidences are brought, it's not just pure reasoning. They're bringing evidences throughout the discussion. So this also is one of the reasons why many scholars, in looking at the Hanafi madhab, would say quite openly that the madhab is as much a product of his students as it is of Abu Hanifa himself. Because of this discussion approach, we would have to say the madhab, from its inception, was that of himself and his students, and not just that of the Imam himself, Abu Hanifa. And their philosophy for delving into hypothetical fiqh, was what they call preparing for a problem before its occurrence. Preparing for a problem before its occurrence. This is an idea, a philosophy, that you don't wait until issues arise and then you deal with it. If you can, prepare for it ahead of time, you reason it out, so once it pops up, you're ready for it. You have a ruling already in place, right? That's the logic behind it. Anyway, it is their school which came to be known as the what-ifer school, because of the fact that when they dealt with these hypothetical issues, they would begin it by saying, what if? What if so-and-so occurred? How would we deal with it? So they became known as the what-ifers, or ara'aytaiyun. The other name that was commonly given to them is Ahlul Ra'i, or the people of opinion, the opinionated ones. But in reality, though these titles were given, to be honest, we can't say that the school was just one of opinions. They did have a firm grounding in hadiths, but they did give precedence to certain rulings and principles over certain hadiths under some circumstances. What we're going to look at now is the basic sources which were used by the Hanafi madhab. We looked at our general 6 sources for fiqh during the period of flowering, and we'll see in each school a variation. This is what we're going to come back to. We had back on page, page 82, 83, and 84, the sources of Islamic law during the flowering. So these sources should be looked at, or the different schools that we're going to look at now, we should judge them on the basis of these basic sources. We'll see in looking at them how they differed slightly. Each one of them had another approach or a slightly different approach. Okay, we'll just take a little 5-minute break here and come right back. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك. Alhamdulillah wa salatu wa salam ala Rasulillah. All praise due to Allah, and may Allah's peace and blessings be on the last messenger of Allah. Continuing with our look at the Hanafi madhab. The sources used by the Hanafi madhab, first and foremost, was the Qur'an as the primary, unquestionable source, authoritative source of Islamic law. We're not going to find any difference in any of the schools with regards to the Qur'an. Its authenticity was undoubtable, so naturally there were no issues regarding it. However, of course, where you might find differences amongst the scholars will be approaches in its interpretation. You might find differences there, where looking at texts and how you deduce or draw principles from the text, this is where some difference may occur. But in terms of, do we accept the text in its whole? We do. Nobody is questioning that. Secondly, the Sunnah. Sunnah is the second source. Nobody questioned it. Prophet Muhammad had already said, I've left with you two things. If you hold on firmly to them, you'll never go astray. The Book of Allah and my Sunnah. So therefore, there's no room for any difference in this regard. So the Sunnah represented the second source. However, they did put a limitation on the Sunnah. And this is something we discussed earlier. Because of the fact that Iraq was the area where the fabrication of hadith began. It first popped its head up. This was where your basic rebellions took place of the Khawarij and the Shia. So with these sectarian trends, fabrication of hadith to support sectarian views naturally came along with it. So the scholars of that area were wary about the hadiths which were being narrated. And especially if we consider the fact that only two of the leading companions settled there, that is Ali ibn Abi Talib and Abdullah ibn Mas'ud. There are other minor Sahaba who were there, but these were the leading two figures who settled there. So what the condition they placed for hadith to be accepted as a legal proof, not necessarily hadith were rejected. They may not reject a hadith as a legal proof. They may reject it as legal proof, but they're still accepting it as a hadith if they didn't have evidence of its inauthenticity. But even if it was established authentic, according to the basic sources, if the hadith was not well known, meaning that it was narrated by a number of other companions or tabi'in, then they were wary of using it as a legal proof. The others they may accept for usage in other areas which have to do with ibadat and things like this, the value of deeds, statements of the Prophet ﷺ in this regard. But as a legal proof for establishing a point of law, they were reluctant to use hadith which were not classified as mashhur. Right? The third source was that of ijma', which we said came up during the time of the second period, which was the time of the righteous caliphs. Consensus of the Sahaba. They would come together, and the consensus of the Sahaba was given precedence over personal opinions. Abu Hanifa regularly did that. Their consensus, what they agreed upon regarding Islamic law, rulings they made, were considered unquestionable. They were the ones who lived the revelation. They best understood it, so what they all agreed upon should be given precedence over what people might agree upon after them. The fourth source was that of individual opinions of the Sahaba. What happened now when you didn't have ijma and the Sahaba differed? What Abu Hanifa would do here now is that he would choose the opinion of the Sahabi which seemed most consistent with the principles that he had developed. Right? Now, if he, looking into an issue, extracting principles from the Qur'an and the Sunnah to deal with this issue, then looking at the opinions of the Sahaba, he couldn't find a united opinion, but then he found among them one or other of the Sahaba whose opinion supported this idea, then he would take that opinion. Right? So he wasn't taking the opinion merely according to what pleased him, but the opinion which seemed to be the most correct. He would look at the Sahaba differed, and he would look at their opinions. And from the sources, the Qur'an and Sunnah, what he would extract, if he saw that this Sahabi's opinion supported them, it was on the basis of that Sahabi's opinion that he would make his ruling. Right? And if he didn't find anything supporting, he would just choose among them what seemed to be the most correct, because he would give precedence to the Sahabi's opinion over his own. The fifth source was qiyas, or analogical deduction. This is what is going to be used now for ijtihad, right? He used it. It was developed widely, we said, in the period following that of the righteous caliphs. Following that of the righteous caliphs, during the Umayyad period, right? Ijtihad was common. And we looked at the factors which led to the commonality of ijtihad. And we said that the main factor was what? What was the main factor which led to the rise in ijtihad during the Umayyad era?
The fabrication of because ijma was not was impossible to do ijma.
One of the factors was the difficulty of ijma, achieving ijma. Why? Because there was another factor before that. The factor before that was the break between the caliphate scholar link, the break in that link. There was a link in the time of the righteous caliphs between the scholars and the caliph. The righteous caliphs had around them the leading scholars of the Sahaba. They prevented them from traveling out, kept them in Mecca and Medina, so that there was that close link. When they had to make rulings, they could bring them together and get a ruling. However, once the caliphate shifted into kingship after the time of Muawiyah and on down, the scholars no longer wanted to be in the presence in the court of the rulers, easy access around the centers where the rulers were, because they were innovating, changing, and they will be forced to make rulings along with them. So they spread left. And we said Abu Hanifa was tortured, etc., because of all this, right? So that was a factor, because of the fact now the scholars now scattering into other centers. They couldn't now call on all the other scholars and come together to come to a ruling. So each individual scholar had to make a ruling. So that's why you had the rise in individual ijtihad. This is an important point to understand, the principle, right? And be sure that it's going to come on your exam. Right? I've repeated it about 3 times now in classes, and each time I've asked you, you haven't been able to give me the answer. So perhaps that will help it to stick in your head. Huh? Anyway, the point is that qiyas was the 5th principle. 6th principle in the Hanafi madhab is what was called istihsan. And we discussed that at length before, where a weaker proof will be given precedence over a stronger deduced proof because of the general need. The need of the community, common practices there required that some rulings, like we talked about the ruling concerning food, hadith which said you shouldn't sell food if you haven't prepared it, right? You don't sell prepared food unless you cook it up, you have it in your hand and you sell it. You don't sell it before you go buy the rice, because maybe you've taken the money, you go to the marketplace, you can't find any rice. Okay, so Prophet ﷺ had, prescribed such, right? So ruling from that, one could draw the conclusion that, hey, you can't sell a house until you built it. You can't sell a boat until you've constructed it. But the common practice was that people had to go out and buy these materials, and they didn't have the money to buy the materials. So you had to sell it before you built it or constructed it. So on the basis of that, they preferred the common practice of selling products, some of the products which were prior to building, as long as it's clear what it was you're going to be building. You've made a picture of it, a drawing of it, the person has identified what they want, and then you can sell it, go and buy the materials and build it. So istihsan, as we said, was practiced really by all of the schools, most of the schools, under different names. Some people might have looked at this one and said, oh, this involves too much opinion. And then they went and developed another one which also involved opinion, but they call it something else. But reality, this was used by all of the schools because it became necessary. Because qiyas, remember we said, qiyas itself was a ruling by reason. It's not revealed law. Revealed law, okay, that's always going to stand. That's always going to be applicable. But when you're deducing principles, you're making some assumptions here. These may be applicable in many circumstances, most circumstances, but not necessarily in all. So that is why laws which are deduced by qiyas, cannot necessarily be written in stone. We say forever, this is how it's going to be. Other scholars can come along and come to other conclusions. Scholars of a later generation can look back at the positions of the different scholars with regards to qiyas and these issues and conclude that another way may be better than the most common way which was held earlier. That possibility remains in existence. The 7th principle was that of urf. And we discussed that at length before, where legal customs or where customs of people did not go against the Sharia rulings, etc., then they were given legal weight. Legal weight not in the sense of producing laws, but in the consideration or in the application of laws. In the application of laws. So a common, we said, terminology, which is known in a particular area, if a contract was made using that terminology, then it must be in accordance with the terminology of the area. You don't take its meaning in other areas and then try to get around the contract. No. So basically there were 7 principles followed by the Hanafi school. In relationship to the 6 identified as the 6 general principles followed during this period of flowering, what is the difference? What is the additional principle which has been added?
The opinion of the Sahaba?
The opinion of individual Sahaba as a separate one. Actually, if you go back to the 6 that were mentioned, they put the opinion of the Sahaba, they gave it in 2 parts. One if they were united, and one if they differed. So this is where your extra principle comes from. So basically, what existed in the Hanafi school is what we looked at as the main 6. They're all there, right? But giving a specific approach to the individual opinion of the Sahaba, where they differed. Now, the main students of Abu Hanifa were 3. He had minor students, but the major students, Zafar ibn al-Hudayl, and he also, like Abu Hanifa, rejected offers to be appointed as judge, and he remained a teacher in Basra until he died. The other 2, Muhammad ibn al-Hasan, he accepted appointment briefly, but soon learned that the compromises it required didn't suit him, so he didn't accept after that. He took it up and left it. Abu Yusuf was the one who accepted appointment. He became the chief judge, Qadi al-Quda, of the Abbasid caliphs, Al-Mahdi and Harun al-Rashid. And of course, these caliphs, Al-Mahdi and Harun al-Rashid, these were among the strong fiqh caliphs who encouraged fiqh. I remember we said Harun al-Rashid was a faqih himself, scholar of Islamic law. So he, accepting that appointment in that time was not bad. You know, requirements of compromise were probably very minor in that period there, right? But he did one thing, which later on when we look to see why the Hanafi madhab became so widespread. Why? Because he, when he was the judge, whenever other judges had to be appointed in different parts of the Muslim realm, he would favor those who were from the Hanafi school, because it was easier to work with them. The issues that came up, they had already agreed on common principles, etc. And so he chose that for convenience. But what that did was it gave a certain level of dominance to the Hanafi madhab, right? So you found then that the Hanafi madhab spread more because people who wanted to become appointed as judges, it became clear that if you want that appointment, best for you to be a master of the Hanafi school. Doesn't mean you weren't necessarily from another school and still were a master of that school yourself, but at least you had to master the Hanafi school, and your rulings would tend to lean in that direction. And eventually, after you're working with the Hanafi school all the time, it would tend to dominate your own line, and you became in the end a Hanafi scholar. So, that transformation would take place. Now, Abu Yusuf studied fiqh in Kufa for 9 years under Abdurrahman ibn Abi Layla, who we mentioned, one of the leading scholars of that region of Iraq, whose father was a Sahabi, right, Abu Layla. And he also studied for 9 years under Abu Hanifa, right, and becoming one of his outstanding students. And he also went to Medina and studied for a brief period under Imam Malik. So he traveled and absorbed the knowledge wherever it was available. Muhammad ibn al-Hasan al-Shaybani, on the other hand, he only studied under Abu Hanifa for a brief period, much less than the others. And he was originally from Wasit and grew up in Kufa. And he spent 3 years studying under Imam Malik in Medina. After Abu Hanifa died, he traveled to Medina and studied under him for 3 years, during which he became a narrator of Al-Muwatta. He memorized the whole Muwatta of Imam Malik and became one of its leading narrators. Among his students was Imam al-Shafi'i later on. Right? In terms of the spread of the madhab, we can see it mostly in India, northern India, southern India is Shafi'i, Sri Lanka is Shafi'i, Pakistan, because that was originally India anyway, Iraq, naturally, Syria, it's the common madhab, Turkey, it became the madhab of the Ottomans. The Ottoman scholars were mostly Hanafi, and when they codified Islamic law in the 19th century, when they codified it according to the Hanafi madhab. And this is, but prior to that, even from the early Ottomans, Hanafi madhab was the dominating madhab, and that also was the key factor for the spread of the Hanafi madhab even further than during the time of Qadi Abu Yusuf. But we also find it in Egypt, it is there, not dominant, but Egypt is dominated by Shafi'is, but you do have a strong Hanafi presence, which is a leftover from the Ottoman era. Also, you find it in Guyana, in South America, in Trinidad, and in Suriname. These are all West Indies, South America. So that is basically the understanding of the Hanafi madhab, its founder, Abu Hanifa, his methodology of teaching, the basic principles of Islamic law, and his students and their approach. Following that, we only have time to look at one more, that is Imam al-Awza'i, Abdurrahman ibn al-Awza'i, whose madhab, the Awza'i madhab, most people don't know about. However, he was a contemporary of Abu Hanifa, born only 5 years after Abu Hanifa, and he was a scholar. He spent most of his life in Beirut. Right? Abu Hanifa was in Kufa, right? More to the east. He was in Beirut, and that's why you have the leading Islamic university in Lebanon is Imam Awza'i University. Right? Anyway, his madhab dominated Syria and Jordan, Palestine, and Lebanon, and it actually went for a period of time dominated Spain. You know, it was that widespread. However, from the 10th century, when Abu Zara, Muhammad ibn Uthman, was appointed as the judge of Damascus, and he was from the Shafi'i madhab, he began the practice of giving a prize of 100 dinars for any student who memorized the book Mukhtasar al-Muzani, which was a book on basic Shafi'i fiqh. So as a result, the Shafi'i madhab spread rapidly in Syria, and the number of Awza'i's followers dwindled until the 11th century, when none were to be found. However, his rulings, and he was a scholar of hadith who made fatawa, rulings, etc. his rulings are preserved in the books of comparative fiqh. All of the various schools later developed books of comparative fiqh where they would compare their rulings to the rulings of the other madhabs, looking at their evidences, etc., etc. And you will find Awza'i's rulings mentioned, consistently through all of these books. In fact, in more recent times, some students of knowledge, scholars, have put together Fiqh of Imam al-Awza'i. So now you can buy on the market in Arabic a book on the Fiqh of Imam al-Awza'i. So it's available now, where they've gathered it from all of the various books of comparative fiqh and rulings which were narrated, and they've put it into a single text under the various headings of fiqh, headings of tahara and salah and etc., etc. So it's now available, but nobody is following it, as a madhab. It's useful from the perspective of seeing other approaches, and he being a leading scholar, his approaches were really as valid, maybe in some cases more valid than the well-known four. Right? But we can see reasons for the dwindling of his madhab. It was not adopted by any of the leading dynasties of the Umayyads, the Abbasids, or the Ottomans, etc. Had they done that, then the leading madhab today, most people might have been from the Awza'i madhab. Because in his time, it dominated most of that, of Sham, the area of Sham, we call Sham, especially the western area of Sham. Right? Abu Hanifa, and that was south. Later on, the madhab competed with the Shafi'i and eventually dominated the Shafi'i in the area of Syria during the Ottoman period. Okay, so that covers basically the first two madhabs that we'll be looking at. We'll be working our way through the others in the coming sessions. Inshallah, they will take us basically up to the midterm, right? Inshallah. Are there any questions anybody would like to ask?
From what you've read at the moment, from what you've explained, it seems that those madhabs were actually very divided from that time already, because for Imam Abu Yusuf to have propagated the madhab of Imam Abu Hanifa, and then Imam Awza'i kind of coming in and all that. So there must have been a very big difference in the fiqh at that time.
No, the issue of their brother's question concerning about differences of fiqh, that the rigid differences that we see later on in the madhabs, you think that they may be available from now, right? Actually, I'll answer that after the adhan. Adhan is going to go now, so we'll take a break. Subhanakallah wa hamdika, ashhadu an la ilaha illa ant, astaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk.